Nobody in Miller's Bend wanted the silent boy nobody could keep, and nobody expected the silent man who never wanted anything at all to be the one who finally kept him. Miller's Bend had buried enough children over the years to know grief on sight, and it thought it knew Silas Cole's kind of grief well enough not to ask questions. He worked his land alone, spoke only when speaking couldn't be avoided, and had done so for 9 long years since a winter that took his wife and infant son in the same terrible night. The boy came to the church steps that same kind of winter, 6 months old and wrapped in a blanket too thin for the cold. No note, no name left behind. 3 families tried to raise him in as many years, and 3 families gave him back, each with a reason that sounded practical enough on its own and added up, together, to something no 4-year-old should have had to understand about himself. Nobody expected Silas Cole to be the one who finally said yes. Least of all Silas himself. The knock came at Silas Cole's door on a Tuesday evening in March. Unexpected enough that he set down his coffee cup with a hand that had gone still with surprise before he'd even reached the latch. Reverend Pruitt stood on the porch, hat in hand, a small boy pressed close against his leg, both of them looking cold and travel-worn in the fading light. "Silas," the Reverend said, "sorry for the hour. I wouldn't have come if I had anywhere else to bring him." Silas looked down at the boy, who looked back up at him with an expression too careful and too watchful for a child of 4, the particular wariness of someone who had learned, young, not to expect much from strangers standing in doorways. "Whose is he?" Silas asked, though he suspected, from the Reverend's face, that he already knew the shape of the answer. "Nobody's, rightly," Pruitt said. "Found on the church steps 4 years back. No name left with him. No family ever traced. The Hendersons took him in near 2 years ago. Brought him back to me this afternoon. Said the winter's been hard. Another baby coming, and they can't rightly stretch what they've got to feed one more mouth that isn't blood kin." "This is the 3rd time," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Everyone in Miller's Bend knew, in the vague way small towns know uncomfortable things, that the orphan boy had been passed between homes more than once. "3rd," Pruitt confirmed, quiet and tired. The Garveys before the Hendersons. Before that, the poorhouse itself, near 2 years running, on account of nobody stepping forward at all. "I've got nowhere left to place him tonight, Silas, and the poorhouse roof's got a leak the size of a dinner plate since last week's storm. I wondered if you might take him in, just for the night. Just till I can sort something more permanent." Silas looked at the boy again, at the too careful stillness of him, the way he stood pressed against the Reverend's leg without reaching for comfort, as though he'd learned already that reaching rarely got answered. Something old and buried shifted in Silas's chest, looking at that particular stillness. He recognized it. He had worn something like it himself, these 9 years past, moving through his own days with the same careful economy of feeling, the same instinct not to reach for anything he might only lose. "What's his name?" Silas asked. "Eli," Pruitt said. "Nobody's rightly sure if it was given him proper or just settled on him by whoever found him that first winter. He doesn't talk much. Dr. Finch says there's nothing wrong with him physically. Just seems he's learned it's safer not to." Silas stood in his doorway a long moment, the cold March evening settling around them, and found himself doing something he hadn't done in 9 years, imagining, however briefly, what it might mean to have a small, careful presence in the empty rooms behind him. "One night," he said finally, though something in his own voice sounded less certain of the limit than the words themselves claimed. "I'll keep him one night. You can sort the rest from there." Pruitt's relief was plain and immediate. "Thank you, Silas. I won't forget this kindness." He crouched down to the boy's level, speaking gently. "Eli, this is Mr. Cole. You'll stay with him tonight. He's a good man. You'll be safe here." The boy said nothing. He only looked up at Silas with those careful, watchful eyes, the particular assessment of a child who had learned that words from grown-ups about safety and kindness didn't always hold true come morning, and Silas felt something in his chest tighten at the sight of it, recognizing an old grief wearing a small, unfamiliar face. "Come on in, then," Silas said, stepping back from the door, his voice rougher than he intended. "It's warm by the fire." The boy hesitated a long moment before finally stepping over the threshold, small and silent and careful, into a house that hadn't held a child's presence in 9 long years. And Silas Cole, watching him go, had no way of knowing yet that one night was about to become the rest of both their lives. The boy did not cry that first night, which unsettled Silas more than crying would have. He sat where Silas placed him, near the fire, small hands folded in his lap, and watched the room with the same careful stillness he'd shown on the porch, as though cataloging every exit, every unfamiliar shadow, every small danger a strange house might hold. Silas made a simple supper, more than his usual portion, unsure exactly how much a 4-year-old ought to eat, and erring, out of some instinct he didn't examine too closely, toward generosity. The boy ate slowly, carefully, watching Silas over each bite as though expecting the food to be taken away before he finished. "You can eat," Silas said finally, the words coming out gruffer than he meant. "Nobody's taking it from you." The boy paused, fork halfway to his mouth, and looked at Silas with an expression that carried more doubt than any 4-year-old ought to have learned yet, before continuing, slightly less carefully, to eat. Silas had not spoken this many words in a single evening in longer than he could easily remember. He found himself, oddly, wanting to fill the silence further, though he had no practice at it and no notion of what a man ought to say to a child he'd known only a few hours. "Cold night," he tried finally. "Storm might blow in by morning." The boy said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward the window, toward the darkening sky, with an attentiveness that suggested he understood weather better than a boy his age reasonably should, another small mark of a childhood that had taught him to watch closely for signs of trouble. Silas made up a bed for him near the fire, an old quilt folded thick against the floor's chill, and the boy lay down without complaint, without asking for anything more, curling small and careful under the blanket with his back to the wall, the particular posture of someone who'd learned to sleep lightly, ready to wake at the first sign of danger. Silas sat up a long while after, in his chair by the banked fire, watching the small shape of the sleeping boy and feeling something old and complicated move through his chest. Not quite grief, though grief lived close beside it, and not quite hope, though something like hope stirred there too, cautious and unfamiliar after 9 years of careful avoidance. He thought of the cradle in the barn loft, built with his own hands the winter his wife carried their son, never once used, never quite able to be destroyed either. He thought of how easily love, once let in, had a way of costing everything a man had to give. One night, he reminded himself, watching the boy's small chest rise and fall in the firelight. Just one night. But even as he thought it, some old, buried part of him understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that one night was already proving considerably harder to keep to than he'd bargained for. He woke before dawn to find the boy already awake, sitting up against the wall, watching him with the same careful stillness as the evening before, as though he'd been awake some while already, uncertain whether it was safe to move before the grown man in the house stirred first. "Morning," Silas said, his voice rough with sleep. The boy didn't answer, but something in his careful expression eased, just slightly, seeing that Silas's first words upon waking carried no anger in them, no complaint at having been given house-room for the night. Silas made breakfast, and found, watching the boy eat with slightly less caution than the evening before, that the thought of the Reverend coming to collect him that morning, to sort out some more permanent arrangement, sat considerably heavier in his chest than he was prepared to examine closely. Word traveled through Miller's Bend by Thursday that Silas Cole had taken in the orphan boy, and the town, true to its nature, formed its opinions quickly and without much patience for nuance. Beulah Sharp, who ran the boarding house and considered herself keeper of the town's collective good sense, delivered her verdict at the general store within earshot of half a dozen customers. "A man who hasn't spoken 20 words together in 9 years, raising a child alone," she said, shaking her head over a bolt of gingham. "That boy's had enough hard luck without adding a cold house to the list of it. Mark me, he'll be back at the Reverend's door inside a month." Reverend Pruitt, who happened to be present, chose that moment to speak up, mild but firm. I've known Silas Cole a long while. Beulah, he said. Cold isn't the word I'd choose. Careful, maybe. A man doesn't grieve the way he's grieved and come out the other side reckless with his heart. Careful's no use to a 4-year-old who needs holding, Beulah said, unconvinced. The Reverend didn't argue further, though he carried the exchange with him on his ride out to Silas's ranch that Friday, curious despite himself what he'd find. What he found was Silas kneeling in the yard beside the boy, both of them intent on a task that took the Reverend a moment to place. Silas was teaching Eli to whittle, guiding the boy's small hands around a knife with the same careful patience he might have used gentling a nervous colt, murmuring instructions too low for the Reverend to catch from the gate. He didn't announce himself right away. He watched a moment longer, taking in the sight of Eli's face, still careful, still watchful, but softened at the edges in a way it hadn't been on the church steps 3 days before, the particular softening of a child beginning, cautiously, to test whether a place might actually be safe. Reverend, Silas said, having noticed him at the gate without turning around, some old rancher's instinct for approaching riders. Didn't mean to intrude, Pruitt said, coming forward. Only wanted to see how you two were settling. Silas straightened, brushing wood shavings from his knees. Boy's got a steady hand, he said. Didn't expect that. Eli, for his part, said nothing, but held up the small, roughly shaped piece of wood he'd been working, the beginnings of what might, with time, become a horse, with an expression that carried, unmistakably, a child's shy pride in a first accomplishment. That's fine work, Pruitt told him, and something flickered across the boy's face, quick and startled, as though praise were a language he hadn't yet learned to trust. Silas watched that flicker too, and something in his own weathered face went tight and complicated, watching a child flinch, however slightly, from a kind word. I've been meaning to ask you plain, Pruitt said, once Eli had wandered a few steps off to examine something in the grass, whether you mean this to be more than the one night we spoke of. I don't ask to press you. I ask because that boy's been moved 3 times already, and a 4th disappointment might do him harm the first 3 didn't quite manage. Silas was quiet a long moment, watching Eli crouch in the grass, absorbed now in whatever small discovery had caught his attention, entirely unaware of the conversation deciding his future a few yards off. I buried a wife and a son 9 years back, Silas said finally, his voice low and rough. Told myself after that I wasn't fit to try again. Didn't trust myself not to fail at it, or lose it, same as before. And now, Pruitt asked gently, now I've got a boy in my yard learning to whittle who flinched at a kind word same as I'd have flinched 9 years back, myself, Silas said. Don't rightly know what to call that, except that I don't intend to be the 4th family that sends him back. Pruitt felt something ease in his own chest, hearing that, a worry he'd carried since Thursday finally settling. That's all I needed to hear, he said. I'll see the paperwork through proper, then. Make it official, if you're willing. I'm willing, Silas said, and turned to watch the boy a moment longer, wood shavings still scattered at his feet, before adding, quieter, more to himself than to the Reverend. Been a long while since anything in this yard felt worth staying careful for. It was Amos Teague, Silas's hired hand these 6 years past, who first noticed the change in his employer that spring. Small things, mostly, the kind only a man who'd worked alongside someone in near total silence for years might catch. Silas hummed sometimes now, low and tuneless, mending fence with the boy trailing a few steps behind him, handing up tools with the fierce seriousness of a child determined to be useful. Silas spoke more, too, not to Amos particularly, but to Eli, low-running commentary on the work at hand. This post needs setting deeper, mind the barbed end. Good. That's it, just like that. Words offered so steadily and naturally that it took Amos a full week to realize how remarkable their sheer volume actually was, for a man who'd once gone whole days without a syllable. You've gone soft, boss, Amos said one evening, grinning, as they watched Eli chase a barn cat across the yard with the single-minded joy particular to small children given, at last, room enough to simply play. Silas didn't argue the point, which was, Amos reflected, itself a kind of answer. It was that same week that Eli, exploring the barn with the fearless curiosity of a boy settling properly into a new home, found his way up the loft ladder while Silas was occupied with the horses below, and discovered, tucked back in a corner beneath an old canvas tarp, a small wooden cradle, carefully built, entirely unused, gathering 9 years of dust. "What's this?" he called down, already dragging the tarp aside for a better look. Silas came up the ladder faster than his usual measured pace, and something in his face, seeing what the boy had found, made Eli go still and uncertain, the particular carefulness of a child who'd learned to read a grown-up's mood for warning signs. "That's," Silas started, then stopped, crouching down beside the cradle, running one weathered hand along its edge with a tenderness that surprised even himself. "That's something I built a long time ago." "For who?" Eli asked, cautious now, sensing without fully understanding that he'd stumbled into something significant. Silas was quiet a long moment, turning the truth over, deciding, with a deliberateness that marked a real turning point in how he meant to raise this boy, that Eli deserved honesty even when honesty was hard. "I had a wife once," he said slowly, "and we were going to have a baby. I built this for him before he was born. But things went wrong the night he came, and I lost them both, same night, same hour. Never could bring myself to use it after. Never quite managed to get rid of it either." Eli sat very still, absorbing this with the particular gravity children sometimes bring to grown-up grief, understanding, in some instinctive way beyond his years, that he was being trusted with something fragile. "Is that why you were sad?" he asked finally. "Before I came." "I suppose it is," Silas admitted. Eli considered this, his small face working through some private calculation, before he reached out and rested one hand, careful and light, on the edge of the cradle beside Silas's own weathered hand. "I'm sorry your baby didn't get to use it," he said, with a simple, unguarded sincerity that struck Silas somewhere deep and unhealed. "But I'm glad you didn't throw it away. Maybe it was waiting for somebody." Silas looked at the boy a long moment, something thick and unfamiliar rising in his throat, and found, for the first time in 9 years, that he could not immediately name whether what he felt was grief or gratitude, or some entirely new thing built from both at once. "Maybe it was," he said finally, his voice rough. He did not move the cradle down from the loft that day, nor the day after. But he found himself, over the following weeks, climbing up now and then simply to look at it, and understood, slowly, that its meaning had shifted somehow, in the telling, no longer only a monument to what he'd lost, but a strange, quiet reminder of what he'd since, against every expectation, been given instead. Hannah Voss had taught school in Miller's Bend for 11 years, long enough to know every family within riding distance, and long enough, too, to have watched Silas Cole's grief from a careful distance, respecting the wall he'd built around himself even as some quiet, patient part of her had never quite stopped hoping it might someday come down. She met Eli properly on his first day of school, a small watchful boy of 5 clutching a slate Silas had bought him at the general store, standing just inside the schoolhouse door with the particular stillness of a child uncertain whether this new place, too, might send him away before the day was through. "You must be Eli," she said, crouching to his level with the easy warmth she'd perfected over a decade of first days. "I'm Miss Voss. I hear you already know your letters better than some boys twice your age." Eli said nothing, but something in his careful expression eased slightly at her tone, and he allowed himself to be led to a seat near the front, close enough that Hannah could offer quiet encouragement through the day without drawing the other children's notice. Silas came to collect him that afternoon, waiting at the gate with the same economy of movement he brought to everything, and Hannah found herself, walking Eli out to him, taking rather longer over the small errand than it strictly required. "He did well today," she said, quick with his letters. Quiet, but attentive. Silas nodded, watching Eli scramble up onto the wagon seat with visible pride at having survived his first day intact. "Thank you for looking after him," Silas said, and Hannah, who had heard perhaps 24 words from this man in as many years, found herself unexpectedly moved by the plain sincerity of it. "It's no trouble," she said. "He seems a fine boy." "He is," Silas said, simple and certain, and something in the way he said it. Not defensively, not performing fatherly pride for an audience, but simply stating a fact he'd come to know as true. Settled something in Hannah's chest that she'd carried carefully and privately for longer than she was quite ready to examine. Over the following months, the after-school exchanges at the gate became a small, steady ritual. A few sentences traded each afternoon about Eli's progress, about the weather, about nothing of particular consequence. And yet Hannah found herself, more than once, arranging her own schedule to ensure she was the one walking Eli out rather than her assistant. It was Beulah Sharp, inevitably, who noticed first and remarked on it with her usual bluntness at the next quilting circle. "You've taken a shine to that Cole boy," she said to Hannah, not unkindly, though the observation carried its own probing weight. "Or is it the father you've taken a shine to?" Hannah kept her eyes on her stitching, though her color rose slightly. "I've taken a shine to a fine student," she said. "Nothing more complicated than that." Beulah's raised eyebrows suggested she believed exactly none of it. But she let the matter drop, and Hannah, riding home that evening past the turnoff to Silas's ranch, found herself glancing down the road longer than the glance strictly required, wondering, not for the first time, whether a man who'd spent 9 years guarding himself against loss might ever find room, in whatever careful accounting he kept of his own heart, for a woman who'd been quietly waiting, without ever once pressing the matter, for considerably longer than she'd let herself admit, even to herself. The trouble came on an ordinary Saturday at the general store, the kind of small, cruel moment that arrives without warning and lodges itself afterward, someplace it can't easily be dislodged from. Eli, 6 now, had come along with Silas to collect supplies, and was occupied examining a shelf of penny candy with the careful, deliberating seriousness he brought to most decisions, when Beulah Sharp, speaking to another customer in a voice she likely didn't intend to carry as far as it did, delivered an opinion she'd apparently been nursing for some while. "I still say it's an unnatural arrangement," she said. "A hard, silent man raising a child that nobody else wanted. Boys bound to grow up strange for it, mark me. Some children just aren't meant to be easy to love, and I don't know that Silas Cole's the sort of man equipped to manage a difficult one." Eli went very still at the candy shelf, and Silas, several feet away examining a coil of rope, felt every word land like a blow, watching the boy's small shoulders draw inward, watching him set down the candy he'd been considering with a careful, deliberate slowness that broke something loose in Silas's chest. He crossed the store in 3 long strides, and Beulah, seeing him coming, had the grace to look briefly uncertain, though not uncertain enough to apologize before he reached her. "Beulah," Silas said, his voice low and even, carrying nonetheless to every corner of the small store. "That boy is not unnatural, and he is not difficult, and he is not unwanted. He is mine, has been these 2 years, and will go on being mine long after you've found some other family's business to trouble yourself with." The store had gone entirely silent, every customer present suddenly very interested in whatever task had brought them there, and Beulah's mouth opened and closed once before she managed a response. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Silas said, quieter now, but no less firm. "You meant it plain enough that a 6-year-old boy heard every word of it. I'd ask you to mind your meaning better, in future, particularly where children are standing close enough to carry it home with them." He turned from her before she could answer further, and crossed back to where Eli stood, still frozen at the candy shelf, his small face carefully, deliberately blank in the particular way children learn when they're trying hard not to show how much something has hurt them. Silas crouched down to his level, something he rarely did in public, unconcerned for the moment with whatever else the store's customers might make of it. "You heard what Mrs. Sharp said," he said, plain and direct, because he had decided, since that first honest conversation about the cradle, that honesty served this boy better than pretending unpleasant things hadn't happened. Eli nodded, not meeting his eyes. It isn't true, Silas said. Not one word of it. You hear me, Eli. You are not unnatural, and you are not difficult, and you are not unwanted. You are mine, and I am glad of it every single day. And anyone who says different is simply wrong, plain as that. Eli looked up at him then, something uncertain and hopeful working across his young face. Really? He asked, small and careful. Really? Silas said, firm and certain. Now pick out your candy. We've got fence to mend before supper. Eli's small face broke, finally, into something like a real smile, and he turned back to the shelf with rather more confidence than before, and Silas straightened, aware of the store's continued careful silence around him, and found, for the first time since taking Eli in, that he did not care one particle what Miller's Bend thought of the shape their family had taken. Beulah Sharp said nothing further, that day or for some while after. The word of the exchange traveled through the town by evening, and if it did not entirely change her private opinions, it did, at least, teach her considerably more caution about voicing them within a child's hearing ever again. Eli's difficulty at school, when it came, arrived not from any failing of his own, but from the particular cruelty children sometimes learn secondhand from the careless talk of grown-ups at their own supper tables. By the time he was 8, most of Miller's Bend had grown accustomed enough to the sight of the orphan boy raised by the silent rancher that Beulah Sharp's old opinions had mostly faded into background noise. But children carry their families' half-formed prejudices without fully understanding them, and there remained, among a handful of Eli's classmates, an undercurrent of teasing that took root that autumn and proved difficult to uproot. Nobody wanted you first, a boy named Frank Dutton said one recess, with the casual cruelty particular to children who don't yet understand the weight of words. My pa says 3 families gave you back before old Cole took pity on you. Eli said nothing, which had become, over years of careful self-protection, his most reliable defense. But Hannah, watching from the schoolhouse steps, saw the way his shoulders drew inward, the particular stillness she'd come to recognize as his way of absorbing a blow without showing it landed. She addressed it in class that same afternoon, carefully, without singling anyone out by name, speaking to the whole room about kindness and the particular unfairness of judging a person by circumstances entirely outside their own choosing. It helped some. It did not entirely solve the trouble. It was Eli himself who finally brought it to Silas, some weeks later, on an evening when the boy had grown unusually quiet even by his own reserved standards, picking at his supper with none of his usual appetite. Something troubling you? Silas asked, direct as always, having learned that Eli responded better to plain questions than to careful coaxing. Eli was quiet a long moment before answering. Frank Dutton says nobody wanted me first, he said finally, not looking up from his plate. Says 3 families gave me back before you took pity on me. Silas set down his own fork, giving the matter the full weight of his attention. That's not quite the truth of it, he said carefully. It's true 3 families couldn't keep you. That's their own hard circumstances, Eli, not any failing in you. But I didn't take you in out of pity. I want you to understand that plain, because it matters. Then why? Eli asked, looking up now, something raw and uncertain in his young face. Silas considered the question seriously, wanting to answer it with the same honesty he'd brought to the conversation about the cradle years before. I'd buried my own family 9 years before you came to my door, he said slowly. Told myself I was done trying, done risking that kind of loss again. Then Reverend Pruitt brought you to my porch, and I looked at you, and something in your face reminded me of every chance I never got to have with my own boy. I didn't take you in out of pity, Eli. I took you in because some part of me recognized something in you worth fighting for, and I haven't regretted a single day of it since. Eli sat with that a long moment, working through it with the same careful gravity he brought to most things, before asking, quiet and small, so I wasn't just leftover from everyone else not wanting me. No, Silas said, firm and certain. You were exactly the thing I didn't know I still needed. There's a difference, Eli, between being unwanted by some and being precisely wanted by the right one. I'd say you've had considerably more of the second than most folks ever get." Something eased in Eli's face at that, a weight visibly shifting, and he ate the rest of his supper with rather more appetite than he'd shown at its start. The following day, Silas rode to the schoolhouse himself, an unusual enough occurrence that Hannah noted it with some surprise, and spoke briefly and plainly to Frank Dutton's father at the fence line after school let out. Not with anger, but with the same quiet, unshakable firmness he'd shown Beulah Sharp 2 years before, and whatever passed between the two men, Frank Dutton's teasing quietly stopped within the week and did not resume. Dr. Ellery Finch had practiced medicine in Miller's Bend for 23 years, long enough to have delivered half the town and buried a fair portion of the other half, and he developed, in that time, a gruff economy of manner that suited Silas Cole's own reserved nature rather better than most of the town's more talkative citizens. Eli's first serious visit to the doctor's office came at age 9. A broken arm suffered falling from the hayloft during an ambitious attempt to reach a barn swallow's nest, and Silas carried the boy in himself, white-faced with a worry he made no particular effort to hide. "Nothing here that won't mend," Doc Finch pronounced, examining the arm with careful hands while Eli bit back tears with a stoicism that impressed the old doctor considerably. "Clean break. 6 weeks in a splint, and he'll be climbing right back up that hayloft. More fool him." Silas's shoulders eased slightly at that, though he kept one hand resting steady on Eli's uninjured shoulder throughout the setting of the bone, a small anchoring presence that Doc Finch noted with quiet interest. "You've taken to this fathering business better than half the men in this county who came to it the ordinary way," Finch observed, once the splint was properly set and Eli had been settled with a peppermint stick as reward for his bravery. "Didn't know I had," Silas admitted. "Still learning it as I go." "Aren't we all?" Finch said. "Man doesn't get handed a manual for it, whether the child arrives by blood or by choice. Best any of us manage is paying close attention and correcting course when we get it wrong." It became, over the following years, something of a habit, Eli's various boyhood scrapes and fevers bringing them regularly to Doc Finch's office, and the old doctor, gruff as he was with most patients, developed a particular warmth for the quiet boy who never complained more than the injury strictly warranted and always, without fail, asked after the health of Finch's aging hound dog before submitting to examination. "You've got a good one there," Finch told Silas more than once, watching Eli's careful, watchful eyes soften whenever the old dog was mentioned. "Careful heart on him. Notices things most children his age don't bother themselves with. Learned that carefulness the hard way, I expect," Silas said, and Finch, understanding the weight behind the words, didn't press further. It was Finch, too, who noticed, before almost anyone else in town, the particular way Silas's own careful reserve had begun, slowly, to soften around the edges where Eli was concerned, not into easy talkativeness, which never came naturally to the man, but into a kind of steady, demonstrative attention that spoke louder than words might have managed anyway. "You watch him close," Finch observed once, watching Silas's eyes track Eli's every movement across the waiting room while they discussed some minor ailment. "Man doesn't get a second chance at this without paying proper attention the first time," Silas said, and Finch, who'd lost his own young son to fever decades before and never quite managed a second try at fatherhood himself, felt something old and complicated stir in his own chest at the plain honesty of it. "You're doing right by him, Silas," he said, quieter than his usual gruff manner. "Whatever this town's whispered in the past, that boy's going to grow up knowing exactly what it means to be looked after proper. That's no small thing to give a child who started out with considerably less certainty about it." Silas said nothing to that, but something in his weathered face carried the particular gratitude of a man and used to praise and uncertain how to properly receive it, and Finch, understanding, let the silence stand rather than press for a response neither of them quite needed. It was inevitable, given the particular curiosity of children left too long with a question, that Eli would eventually ask the thing he'd been quietly turning over in his mind for some while, and it arrived on an ordinary evening when he was 10, mending a fence rail alongside Silas with the competent ease of a boy who'd spent years learning ranch work at his father's side. "Do you ever wonder about my real family?" he asked, not looking up from the nail he was carefully positioning. Silas paused in his own work, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I wonder about them sometimes," he admitted. "Wonder what circumstance was hard enough to leave a baby on church steps in the dead of winter. Wonder if whoever did it thought about you after, or made themselves stop thinking for their own sake." "I don't have answers, Eli." Nobody in Miller's Bend ever traced who they were. Eli was quiet a moment, working the nail home with more force than strictly necessary. "I'm not your real family either, though," he said finally, and there was something careful in the way he said it, testing ground he wasn't entirely certain was safe to stand on. "Not by blood." Silas set down his hammer and turned to face the boy fully, understanding this for the significant moment it was. "Blood's one way families get made," he said slowly. "Not the only way, though, whatever some folks in this town might believe. I chose you, Eli. Chose you deliberate, with my eyes open, knowing full well what it might cost me to love something again after what I'd already lost. That's no smaller a claim on family than blood is. Might even be a larger one, given how much easier it would have been to walk away and not choose it at all." Eli considered this with his usual careful gravity, working through it the way he worked through most difficult things, slowly and thoroughly. "I used to think about it a lot," he admitted. "Whether you'd have picked me if some other boy, without so much trouble attached, had come along instead. Boy without 3 families already giving him back." Silas felt something tighten in his chest, hearing the old fear still living in the boy after 6 years together, and understood that some wounds, however well tended, left scars that needed occasional reassurance to keep from aching. "Eli," he said, plain and direct, "I've had 6 years now to reconsider that choice, if I was ever going to. Watched you grow from a boy too frightened to reach for a kind word into someone who whittles better than men twice your age, reads every book Miss Voss can put in front of you, and treats every creature on this ranch, right down to the barn cats, with more gentleness than half the grown men in this county manage. If I had it to choose over again, knowing everything I know now about the particular boy you'd become, I'd choose you faster and surer than I did that first uncertain night on my porch." Eli's eyes had gone bright and unsteady, and he looked down quickly at the fence rail, blinking hard against whatever feeling had risen up too fast to manage gracefully. "I'm glad you did," he said, voice a little rough. "Choose me, I mean." "So am I," Silas said, and reached out, an unusual gesture for a man not given to easy physical affection, to rest his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "So am I, Eli. Every single day of it." They returned to their work after that, the fence rail finished out in comfortable silence. But something had settled between them in the exchange, some old, uncertain question finally given its proper, permanent answer, and Eli found, working alongside his father in the fading evening light, that the particular ache he'd carried quietly for years, the fear of being merely the leftover choice, the boy nobody else wanted, had, at last, properly and permanently, begun to heal. 5 years of quiet, gate-side conversations had built, between Hannah Voss and Silas Cole, something neither of them had quite named aloud, though both understood its shape well enough by now to feel its absence keenly on the rare days circumstance kept them from their usual brief exchange. Hannah had watched Eli grow from a careful, watchful 5-year-old into a thoughtful, capable boy of 10, had watched Silas's own reserved nature soften, year by year, into something considerably warmer than the wall of silence he'd maintained before the boy's arrival, and had come to understand, with the patient clarity of a woman who'd loved carefully and quietly for a long while, that she was witnessing not merely a father's transformation, but the slow, steady healing of a man she'd cared for from a careful distance for the better part of a decade. It was Amos Teague, of all people, who finally forced the matter into the open, cornering Silas at the livery on an ordinary Thursday, with the particular bluntness of a longtime friend who'd grown tired of watching 2 careful people circle each other without ever closing the distance properly. You planning to court that woman proper? Amos asked, without preamble, while they waited on a wagon wheel repair. Or are you two just going to keep trading pleasantries at the schoolhouse gate till one of you dies of old age waiting for the other to speak plain? Silas, caught off guard, took a long moment before answering. Don't rightly know what you mean. You know precisely what I mean, Amos said. 5 years now. You've ridden that boy to school of a morning and collected him of an evening. And 5 years now you've found some reason to linger at that gate longer than strictly necessary. And Hannah Voss has found her own reasons to linger right back. Whole town's noticed it, but the two of you, seemingly. Silas was quiet a long moment, turning the observation over with the same careful seriousness he brought to most difficult matters. Been afraid to risk it, he admitted finally, the honesty costing him something to voice aloud, even to an old friend. Lost enough already, Amos. Wife, son, near a decade of my own life spent grieving it before Eli came along and taught me there was still something in me worth risking again. Don't know that I've got room in me to risk losing a second chance at happiness on top of everything else. Amos considered that with more gravity than his usual teasing manner suggested he was capable of. Seems to me, he said slowly, you've already proven you've got room for exactly that kind of risk. Proved it the night you let that boy through your door instead of sending him back with the Reverend. Man capable of that kind of courage oughtn't be so frightened of a considerably smaller risk, courting a woman who's made her own feelings plain enough to anyone paying proper attention these 5 years running. Silas said nothing further on the matter that day, but he found himself, riding home that evening, turning Amos's words over with more seriousness than he'd expected to give them, and the following week, waiting at the schoolhouse gate for Eli's dismissal, he found himself, for the first time in 5 years of careful, comfortable exchanges, working up the nerve to ask Hannah Voss something rather more significant than her usual report on Eli's progress. Miss Voss, he said, and something in his tone had her looking up with immediate, careful attention. I wondered whether you might do me the honor of Sunday dinner, sometime soon. Just the three of us. Eli's been asking after you rather a lot lately, truth told, and I find I've been doing considerably more of the same. Hannah felt her whole chest go warm and unsteady. 5 years of patient, careful hoping finally rewarded with an invitation she'd nearly given up expecting to receive. I would like that very much, Silas Cole, she said, and found, watching the rare, genuine smile that moved across his weathered face at her answer, that the wait, however long it had stretched, had proven entirely worth its patience. Sunday dinner became, over the following months, a fixture neither Hannah nor Silas quite dared name outright, though Eli, with the particular directness of a child who'd learned to value plain speaking, addressed the matter well before either adult felt ready to. Are you going to marry Miss Voss? He asked one evening, some 4 months into the new arrangement, with the same unguarded gravity he brought to most serious questions. Silas, caught mid-sip of coffee, took a moment to recover his composure. What makes you ask that? You look at her the way Doc Finch says my mother used to look at pictures of you, Eli said, matter of fact. And she brings you coffee just the way you like it without having to ask anymore. Seems like the sort of thing that happens before people marry. Silas set down his cup, considering the boy's observation with more seriousness than he'd expected the conversation to require. Would that trouble you? He asked carefully. If I did marry her. Eli thought about it with his usual thoroughness before answering. No, he said finally. I like her. She's kind, and she doesn't treat me like I'm made of glass on account of how I came to you. And she brought me a whole book of my own last month just because I finished the last one so fast. He paused, then added, with the particular vulnerability children sometimes allow themselves only briefly, before retreating back into careful reserve, I think it might be nice, having a mother. I don't rightly remember ever having one before. Something in Silas's chest went tight and warm at once, hearing that, and he understood, in that moment, that whatever careful courtship he and Hannah had been conducting at their own measured pace had, quite without either adult's deliberate planning, already been decided, in the boy's own quiet way, some while before. He proposed to Hannah the following Sunday, not with elaborate ceremony, but with the same plain, unadorned honesty he brought to everything that mattered, standing with her in the yard while Eli, by careful prior arrangement, occupied himself with the barn cats a discreet distance off. "I've spent 9 years believing I wasn't fit to try loving anyone again," he said, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Then Eli came and taught me otherwise, one careful day at a time. Now you've spent 5 years proving the same lesson all over again, patient as anything, waiting on a man who took considerably longer to work up his courage than you had any right to tolerate. I love you, Hannah Voss, half for longer than I likely let myself admit, even to myself. I'd be honored if you'd marry me and be a proper mother to that boy who's already decided, near as I can tell, that you belong in this family whether either of us gets around to making it official or not." Hannah's eyes had gone bright with unshed tears well before he finished, and she answered without hesitation, 5 years of patient waiting finding, at last, its proper reward. "Yes," she said, simple and certain. "1,000 times yes, Silas Cole." Eli, watching from his carefully arranged distance with rather less discretion than either adult had hoped for, let out a whoop of unguarded delight that carried clear across the yard, abandoning all pretense of occupying himself with the barn cats to run toward them both with an enthusiasm entirely unlike his usual careful reserve. "Does this mean you're really my mother now?" he asked Hannah, breathless with a hope he no longer troubled himself to hide. "It does," Hannah said, crouching down to embrace him properly, "if you'll have me." "I've been hoping for it a long while," Eli admitted, returning the embrace with a fierceness that spoke to years of careful, guarded longing finally allowed its proper expression, and Silas, watching his son and his soon-to-be wife embrace in the golden evening light, understood that whatever fear had kept him locked in careful solitude these 9 long years had, at last, been entirely and properly worth the risking. It came on Eli, at 11 years old, with the same terrible swiftness that had once taken Silas's first wife and infant son, a fever that climbed through a Tuesday afternoon from ordinary tiredness into something that had Hannah's hands shaking as she pressed cool cloths to his burning forehead, and Silas riding hard for Doc Finch with a terror he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 11 long careful years. "Scarlet fever," Finch pronounced grimly, examining the boy's flushed, restless form. "Bad case of it. We'll need to watch him close the next several days. This kind can turn dangerous quick if it's not managed careful." Silas stood in the doorway of Eli's small room, watching Hannah's careful, competent hands tend their son, and felt the old terror of 9 years before rise up in his chest with a force that nearly buckled his knees. The same helpless watching, the same terrible waiting, the same fear that love, once fully given, always eventually demanded its payment and loss. "He's not going to lose him the way he lost them," Hannah said quietly, coming to stand beside him in a rare moment when Doc Finch had taken over the bedside watch, understanding, without needing it explained, exactly what old grief was working through her husband's weathered face. "You don't know that," Silas said, his voice rough and unsteady in a way Hannah had rarely heard from him. "No," she agreed. "I don't know it for certain. Nobody can promise certainty where fever's concerned. But I know Doc Finch caught it early, and I know Eli's strong, and I know that whatever happens, you don't have to carry the fear of it alone this time, the way you carried the grief alone 9 years back. That's the whole difference now, Silas. You've got people beside you this time, whatever comes." Silas said nothing, but he reached for her hand, gripping it tight enough to hurt, and Hannah held on without complaint, understanding that some fears required simply being weathered through together rather than reasoned away entirely. The following 3 days passed in the same anxious blur Eleanor Ashford had once known in a different story, in a different town, though neither family would ever learn of the other's parallel ordeal. Silas and Hannah taking turns at their son's bedside, Doc Finch rarely leaving the small ranch house, Reverend Pruitt arriving twice daily to sit with them and offer what comfort prayer could provide. It was on the 3rd night, with Eli's fever finally beginning to break toward dawn, that Silas, exhausted past his usual careful reserve, found himself speaking aloud, for the first time in 11 years, about the son he'd lost. "I never got to hold him," he said quietly, sitting beside Eli's bed while Hannah dozed in the chair opposite, his voice carrying a rawness he'd never once allowed the town to witness. "My first boy. They wouldn't let me in the room till it was already over, both of them gone within the hour of each other. I've spent 9 years since telling myself I couldn't survive loving something that fragile again, that it was safer to keep the whole world at arm's length rather than risk that particular grief a second time." Hannah, waking at the sound of his voice, said nothing, only listened, understanding this for the significant moment it was, a wall 9 years in the building finally, fully coming down. And then Eli came, Silas continued, his voice breaking slightly, watching his boy's fever-flushed face for any sign of the crisis passing. "And I let myself love him anyway, against every careful instinct I'd built up protecting myself. And now I'm sitting here 3 nights running, terrified I'm about to lose that too, and finding, even so, even with the fear this large, that I wouldn't trade a single day of loving him for the false safety of never having risked it at all." Eli, drifting in and out of feverish sleep, stirred slightly at the sound of his father's voice, and murmured, barely audible, words that neither adult would ever forget. "Not going anywhere, Pa," he mumbled, more asleep than awake. "Promise." Silas felt something break open in his chest at that small, half-conscious reassurance. 9 years of careful grief finally, fully releasing its grip, and he pressed his weathered hand gently to his son's forehead, finding it, at last, blessedly cool. "He's turning," he said, voice thick with relief and unshed tears both at once. "Hannah, he's turning." Doc Finch, summoned immediately, confirmed it within the hour. The fever properly broken, the crisis past, Eli's recovery now simply a matter of rest and patient care. Silas sat with his son through the rest of that dawn, watching him sleep peacefully for the first time in 3 days, and understood, with a clarity that would shape the whole remainder of his life, that he had finally, fully, let go of the fear that had governed him for 9 long, careful years. Not because the risk of loss had disappeared, but because he'd learned, at last, that the love was worth the risk regardless. Eli's recovery, once begun, proceeded steadily through the following week, and with it came a subtle but permanent shift in the household that Hannah noticed before Silas himself fully understood it. The last careful reserve he'd maintained even through their courtship and marriage had, somewhere in those 3 anxious nights, finally and completely dissolved. He spoke more now, not merely to Eli in the practical running commentary of ranch work, but to Hannah too, in the easy evening conversations of a man no longer holding some essential part of himself carefully in reserve against future loss. He laughed more, a sound Hannah had heard perhaps a handful of times in their whole courtship, now surfacing regularly at Eli's recovering wit and Amos's teasing both. "You've changed since that fever," Amos observed one afternoon, watching Silas actually whistle, while mending tack in the barn. "Suppose I have," Silas admitted. "Spent 3 nights certain I was about to lose him same as I lost the first one, and came out the other side understanding something I hadn't rightly grasped before." "What's that?" Amos asked. "That the fear of losing something was costing me nearly as much as actually losing it would have," Silas said. 9 years, I kept myself careful and closed off, telling myself I was protecting against a grief I couldn't survive twice. Near lost him anyway, fever caring nothing for how carefully I'd guarded my heart against it. Difference is, this time I had people beside me through it, on account of finally letting them close enough to stand there. Don't intend to go back to keeping that kind of distance again, whatever risk it carries. Amos, not a man given to sentiment, found himself nonetheless moved by the plain honesty of it, and clapped his old friend on the shoulder with rather more warmth than his usual gruff manner allowed. "Good thing, too," he said. "Whole town's noticed the change, you know." Even Beulah Sharps stopped her old talk about cold, silent men not fit for raising children. Word round town now is that Silas Cole's about the warmest father Miller's Bend has ever had occasion to witness. Once he finally worked up the nerve to show it plain. Silas found, over the following months, that this warmth extended readily into every corner of his previously guarded life. He took to attending church regularly alongside Hannah and Eli, something he'd avoided in his years of solitary grief. He accepted supper invitations from neighbors he'd previously kept at careful arm's length. He spoke, when spoken to, with an ease that surprised even longtime acquaintances who'd known only his old careful reticence. Eli, fully recovered and growing quickly now into the sturdy, capable boy his childhood illnesses had never quite managed to slow permanently, noticed the change in his father too, though he understood it, with his usual careful gravity, rather more simply than the town's gossip managed. "You talk more now," he observed one evening, the two of them working together on some minor repair to the porch railing. "I suppose I do," Silas agreed. "Why?" Eli asked, curious rather than critical. Silas considered the question seriously, as he considered most things Eli asked him. "I spent a long while believing that keeping quiet kept me safe," he said finally. "Safe from caring too much about anything I might lose again. Near lost you to that fever, and understood, somewhere in those 3 hard nights, that the quiet hadn't been protecting me from anything. Just kept me from properly living the years I did have, worrying too much over years I might not." Eli absorbed this with his usual thoughtful seriousness before offering his own quiet observation. "I like you talking more," he said simply. "Makes it easier to know what you're thinking. Used to have to guess a lot before." Something in Silas's chest went warm and full at that small, honest admission, and he found himself, working alongside his son in the fading evening light, grateful in a way that went beyond words for the fever that had, however terrifying its 3 nights had proven, finally broken loose the last of the careful silence he'd carried for 9 long, guarded years. Hannah's role in the family, once officially sealed by marriage, deepened over the following 2 years into something Eli came to rely upon with a trust that surprised even Hannah herself, given how carefully she'd approached the whole matter of becoming a mother to a boy already 12 years old and set. She'd worried, in his own particular ways of managing the world. She found, instead, that Eli welcomed her steady presence with an openness that spoke to years of quiet longing for exactly this kind of care, someone to notice the small things, to remember which stories he preferred read twice through, to catch the particular quality of silence that meant something was troubling him even when he hadn't yet found words for it himself. It was Hannah who noticed, in his 13th year, that Eli had begun spending unusual amounts of time alone at the edge of the property, near the old boundary marker that separated Cole land from the county road. And it was Hannah, rather than Silas, who finally found the patience and a careful, gentle questioning to understand why. "I keep thinking about them," Eli admitted finally, one evening when she'd followed him out to the boundary marker and settled beside him without pressing for immediate explanation. "My real parents, whoever they were, wondering why they left me there, on those church steps. Wondering if they think about me at all." Hannah considered her response carefully, understanding the weight of the moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that wondering about them doesn't mean you love your father any less. Some things a person needs to wonder about, whatever family they've been given since. It's a natural kind of curiosity, Eli, not a betrayal of anyone." "Does Pa know I think about it?" Eli asked, worried now. "I wouldn't want him thinking I'm not grateful for everything he's given me. He knows plenty about grief and complicated feelings existing alongside gratitude, both at once," Hannah said gently. "I don't imagine he'd think less of you for wondering about the family that came before him. If anything, I think it might mean something to him, you trusting him enough to talk about it plain, rather than carrying it alone and quiet the way you might have, before he taught you it was safe to speak difficult things aloud." Eli considered this a long moment, working through it with his usual careful thoroughness, before finally nodding, some old worry visibly easing. "Will you tell him," he asked, "that I've been thinking about it? I don't rightly know how to bring it up myself. I'll let him know you'd like to talk, if you're ready," Hannah said. But I think, when the time comes, it ought to be your words that tell him, not mine secondhand. He'd want to hear it from you plain, same as he's always given you plain honesty in return. The conversation, when Eli finally worked up the courage to have it directly with Silas some weeks later, proved considerably easier than the boy had feared, Silas listening with the same steady, undemonstrative attention he brought to everything that mattered to his son, offering no judgment, only the same plain honesty that had marked their relationship from its earliest days. Wondering about them doesn't take anything away from what we've got, he told Eli simply. I'd wonder too, in your position. Wish I had answers to give you, son, but I don't, and I won't pretend otherwise just to spare either of us the discomfort of not knowing. It was, Eli understood, watching his father's plain, unflinching honesty on a subject that might easily have wounded a lesser man's pride. One more small proof of the particular kind of love Silas Cole had spent 9 careful years learning to give. Not a love that demanded gratitude or required Eli's curiosity about his origins to be suppressed for Silas's comfort, but a love secure enough in itself to make room, without jealousy or insecurity, for whatever complicated feelings the boy still carried about the family that had, through hard circumstance rather than any fault of his own, been forced to let him go. Hannah watched the exchange from the doorway, understanding, with the particular clarity of a woman who'd waited patiently for years to become part of exactly this family, that she had married a man whose capacity for love, once properly unlocked, had proven far deeper and steadier than even his own 9 years of careful guarding had ever quite managed to suppress. Time moved the way it always did in Miller's Bend, steady and unhurried, and Eli grew from the careful, watchful boy of the church steps into a young man of 17 who carried his father's quiet strength alongside his own thoughtful, curious mind, a combination that had, by his final year of schooling, made him something of a favorite among the town's younger families, who trusted him readily with everything from mending fences to tutoring their own children in reading. But 17 brought its own particular restlessness, the kind that settles into young men who've begun to sense the wider world existing beyond the boundaries of the only home they've ever properly known. And Hannah noticed it first, in the careful, unfinished sentences Eli began offering at supper, in the way he'd taken to reading, with unusual intensity, every newspaper Amos brought back from his trips to the county seat. There's talk of railroad work out west, Eli mentioned one evening, not quite meeting either parent's eyes. Good wages, they say. Man could see considerably more of the country than Miller's Bend allows for. Silas set down his fork carefully, understanding, with the particular attentiveness he'd cultivated over 13 years of careful fathering, that this was not idle conversation but the beginning of something Eli had been turning over privately for some while. You thinking of going? He asked, direct as always, though something careful had entered his voice. Eli hesitated, the old careful stillness returning to his shoulders, the particular posture Silas remembered well from that very first night on the porch, 13 years gone now. I don't rightly know, Eli admitted finally. I've spent my whole life here, Pa. Everyone in this town knows my whole story, every family that gave me back, every hard thing about where I started. Sometimes I wonder what it might feel like, going somewhere nobody knows any of that. Starting fresh, as just myself, not the orphan boy nobody wanted before you took me in. Silas absorbed this carefully, and Hannah, watching her husband's face, recognized the particular effort it cost him to keep his own fear from showing plainly at the prospect of Eli's departure. That's a fair thing to want, Silas said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. Man's got a right to go find out who he is, apart from the story other folks have told about him his whole life. I won't stand in your way, if that's truly what you decide you need. Eli looked up, surprised by the plain generosity of the response. You wouldn't mind, he asked. Truly, I'd mind terribly. Missing you, Silas admitted, his voice rough with an honesty that still, even now, cost him some effort to offer plainly. But minding your absence and standing in your way are two different things, Eli. I learned a long while back that loving someone properly sometimes means letting them go find their own path, even when every part of you wants to hold on tighter instead. The conversation settled there for the evening, but it marked the beginning of a season that would prove, for the whole family, considerably more difficult than any of the fevers or old fears that had come before it. Not a crisis of illness or loss, but the quieter, harder crisis of a young man working out, for the first time, exactly who he wanted to become, separate from the family that had shaped him. The letter arrived in early spring, addressed to Eli directly, offering him a position with a railroad survey crew heading west into the territories, good wages, and steady work for a young man willing to travel hard country for months at a stretch, and Eli carried it around folded in his shirt pocket for the better part of a week before finally bringing it to the supper table. "I've been offered work," he said, laying the letter beside his plate without immediately explaining further. "Railroad survey crew. They'd want me gone by month's end, if I take it. Might be gone the better part of a year, maybe longer, depending how the work goes." The table went quiet, Hannah's hands stilling over her own plate, Silas's careful, weathered face working through something complicated before he finally spoke. "That's a fair distance from home," he said carefully. "It is," Eli agreed. He hesitated, then added, with more vulnerability than he'd shown in some while, "I keep going back and forth on it. Part of me wants awful bad to see something of the world beyond Miller's Bend. Part of me can't quite stomach the thought of being that far from you both, after everything." Silas considered his response with the same deliberate care he brought to every significant conversation with his son, understanding the weight of what Eli was truly asking, beneath the practical question of railroad work. "Can I tell you something?" he said finally, "that I don't know that I've ever said plain in all these years." Eli nodded, giving his father his full attention. "The night Reverend Pruitt brought you to my door," Silas said slowly, "I told myself I'd keep you one night, no more. Told myself I wasn't fit to risk loving anything again, not after what I'd lost. And then I looked at you, standing there so careful and watchful, like you'd already learned the world wasn't safe to trust, and something in me understood, even then, that keeping you wasn't really a choice I had much say over anymore. You'd already gotten and passed whatever walls I thought I'd built." He paused, gathering the rest of what he meant to say. 13 years since," he continued, "I've watched you grow into a young man I'm prouder of than I know how to properly say. And now here you are, considering leaving to go find out who you are apart from all of it, and I find myself right back where I started that first night, understanding that loving you properly means I don't get to make this choice for you, however much part of me wants to keep you close and safe forever." Eli's eyes had gone bright, listening to this, more plain feeling from his father in a few minutes than most conversations managed across whole years. "I don't want you thinking I'm running from you, Pa," he said, voice unsteady. "Or from this family. That's not what this is." "I don't think that," Silas said, firm and certain. "I think you're a young man doing exactly what young men are meant to do, working out who you want to become. That's not running from us, Eli. That's simply growing. The way growing's supposed to work, whatever fear it stirs up in an old man who's spent 13 years getting used to having you underfoot." Hannah, who'd remained quiet through the exchange, finally spoke, her own voice carrying the particular steadiness she'd brought to the family from its earliest days. "Whatever you decide," she said, "this home will still be here. That won't change, whether you're gone a year or 10. You'll always have a place to come back to, Eli. That's not a thing distance or time can undo." Eli looked between his parents a long moment, something working through his young face that spoke to a decision still very much in progress, and said nothing further that evening, though the letter remained on the table beside his plate, unanswered, for the better part of another 2 weeks. Eli found Silas alone in the barn on an evening in early April, mending harness by lantern light with the same careful, patient attention he'd brought to every task across the 15 years of Eli's life. And something in the quiet, ordinary scene, his father's weathered hands working steady leather, the barn cats curled near the lantern's warmth, the particular smell of hay and horse and old wood that had meant home to Eli since he was 4 years old, settled, at last, the question he'd been carrying for weeks. "I've decided against the railroad work," he said, without preamble, settling onto an overturned bucket near his father's work. Silas looked up, careful not to let his own relief show too plainly, wanting Eli's decision to be fully his own rather than shaped by any visible parental hope. "What settled it?" he asked. Eli considered the question seriously before answering. "I kept trying to picture it," he said slowly. "Being out there, months from home, working alongside strangers who'd known nothing of my story. And I realized, turning it over these past weeks, that I don't actually want to be known as just myself, apart from everything that's happened here. I want to be known as your son, Pa. That's not something I'm trying to escape. It's the truest thing about who I am." He paused, working through the rest of it with his usual careful thoroughness. "I used to think," he continued, "that starting fresh somewhere new might feel like freedom. But I think what I was really chasing was some notion that I needed to prove I could exist apart from the story of being given back 3 times before you kept me. Like I needed to earn some version of myself that wasn't built on that hard beginning. And now," Silas asked, quiet and attentive, "now I think that hard beginning is part of my story, not something I need to outrun," Eli said. "And the 15 years since, being your son, growing up in this house, learning from you and from Ma both, that's not something separate from who I really am. It's the truest part of it. I don't need to go somewhere new to find myself, Pa. I already know exactly who I am. I'm the boy you chose and kept and raised proper, even when you had every reason to protect yourself from risking it." Silas set down the harness he'd been working, something thick and unsteady moving through his chest. 13 years of careful, undemonstrative love-finding. In this quiet barn conversation, one of its fullest expressions yet. "I'm proud of you, Eli," he said, voice rough. "Prouder than I know how to properly say. Whatever you'd decided, railroad work or staying here, I'd have been proud of the man you've become either way. But I won't pretend I'm not glad of this particular choice." Eli smiled, something easy and unguarded in it that spoke to how thoroughly, over 15 years, he'd learned to trust the safety of this family's love. "I wrote back to the railroad company already," he admitted. "Told them I'd decided to stay closer to home. Amos mentioned there might be foreman work opening up on the Hutchins spread come summer, if I wanted steady ranch work of my own. Thought I might look into that instead. Stay close enough to help out here too, when you need the extra hands." Silas nodded, something warm and settled moving through his weathered face. "Sounds like a fine plan," he said. "Though I'll tell you plain, Eli, whatever work you'd chosen, wherever it took you, this home was always going to remain exactly what your mother told you it would. A place to come back to. That's not going to change, not for as long as I've got breath left to make it true." They sat together a while longer in the lantern-lit barn, father and son, the particular comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed constant words to understand each other fully, and Eli, watching his father's weathered hands return to the harness work, understood, with a clarity that would shape the whole remainder of his life, that he had found, in this quiet, ordinary man who'd once been too frightened to risk loving anything again, the truest kind of home a person could ever hope to have. Eli took the foreman position at the Hutchins spread that summer, close enough to visit home regularly, and settled into the work with the same steady competence he'd brought to everything since childhood, earning, within a year, a reputation across the county as one of the most reliable young ranch hands in the territory. He was 19 now, tall and capable, carrying himself with the particular quiet confidence of a young man who'd finally, fully settled the old, uncertain question of his own worth. And Miller's Bend, watching him grow from the careful, watchful orphan boy into this steady, respected young man, had long since abandoned whatever old skepticism it had once harbored about Silas Cole's fitness for fatherhood. It was Beulah Sharp herself, in fact, who offered perhaps the most striking testament to how thoroughly the town's opinion had shifted, remarking to a newer resident, unaware of the old history, that Eli Cole was precisely the sort of steady, well-raised young man Miller's Bend ought to hold up as an example to every family in the county. Word of the remark reached Silas eventually, by way of Amos's teasing, and Silas received it with the particular quiet amusement of a man who'd long since stopped needing the town's approval to know the truth of his own family. 15 years, Amos said, grinning, and Beulah Sharp's finally come round to admitting you know what you're doing. Took her long enough, Silas said, though there was no real bitterness in it. Only the easy warmth of a man secure enough in his own life to find humor in old prejudices finally, belatedly, corrected. It was that same summer that Reverend Pruitt, now considerably older and slower than the man who'd first brought a frightened 4-year-old to Silas's porch, mentioned, during one of his regular visits, that a barn raising had been planned for a young family newly settled at the edge of town, the kind of community event Miller's Bend still gathered for readily, and that Eli had already volunteered his labor for the effort. Whole town's coming out for it, Pruitt said. Might be a fine occasion, seeing how far you've all come since that first hard winter. Silas found himself, in the days leading up to the barn raising, thinking back over the full 15 years with an unusual clarity. The frightened boy on his porch, the cradle in the barn loft, Beulah's cruel words in the general store, the terrible 3 nights of fever, Hannah's patient years of waiting, Eli's own hard season of working out who he wanted to become. 15 years, he told Hannah one evening, sitting together on the porch as the summer evenings settled gold and warm around them. Feels like both no time at all and an entire lifetime, looking back on it. Best 15 years of my own life, too, Hannah said, resting her head against his shoulder with the easy comfort of 8 years of marriage. Whatever came before it. Silas said nothing further, but reached for her hand, understanding, with the particular gratitude of a man who'd once believed himself entirely closed off from further happiness, that the barn raising approaching that weekend would mark, in ways he couldn't yet fully anticipate, something considerably more significant than a simple community gathering. The barn raising fell on a bright June Saturday, the whole of Miller's Bend turning out to help, the particular communal energy of a small town coming together for honest labor, and, once the work was done, the shared meal and easy fellowship that always followed such gatherings. Eli worked alongside Silas through the long, hot morning, the two of them moving with the practiced ease of men who'd worked together countless times, hauling timber and setting beams with a competence that drew admiring notice from the newer families present who hadn't yet witnessed the full extent of what 15 years of steady partnership had built between father and son. By late afternoon, the barn frame stood complete, and the town settled into the long tables laid out across the grass for the shared supper that traditionally closed such gatherings. And it was during this meal, with most of Miller's Bend gathered close enough to hear, that Reverend Pruitt, now genuinely old and increasingly sentimental about the town's shared history, rose to offer a few words of blessing over the completed work. 15 years I've served this town, he said, his voice carrying warm and clear across the gathered crowd. And I've watched a good many families built and rebuilt in that time, through hardship and through grace both. I don't know that I've witnessed a finer example of what patient, steady love can accomplish than what I watched begin on Silas Cole's porch 15 years back this very spring, when a frightened boy nobody else could keep found, at last, a home that meant to keep him. The crowd's attention turned, warm and expectant, towards Silas and Eli, and Silas, uncomfortable as always with public attention, found himself nonetheless unable to look away from his son's face, watching something significant working across Eli's expression. Eli rose slowly from the table, and the crowd's easy chatter quieted, sensing, correctly, that the young man had something he meant to say. I don't talk much, in front of crowds, he began, and a ripple of gentle, knowing laughter moved through the gathering, recognizing in the observation an echo of his father's own long-known reserve. Learned that from my pa, I suppose, along with near everything else worth knowing. He paused, gathering himself, and Silas felt his own chest go tight with an anticipation he couldn't quite name. 15 years ago, Eli continued, his voice growing steadier as he found his way into what he meant to say, I was 4 years old, and I'd already learned that being given back was simply what happened to boys like me. 3 families tried and couldn't keep me, and I understood, young as I was, that I wasn't the sort of child folks kept around, not without some fault in me making it too hard. The gathered crowd had gone entirely silent now, even the children stilled by the particular gravity in Eli's voice. And then Reverend Pruitt brought me to a silent man's porch, expecting, I think, same as everybody else, that this would prove one more brief stop before somewhere more permanent got sorted out. Eli went on. Except my pa didn't send me back. Not that first night, not any night since. 15 years, and he never once made me feel like I was some burden he was managing out of obligation or pity. He taught me to whittle, and to mend fence, and to read weather in the sky before a storm rolled in. He sat with me 3 nights running when fever nearly took me, same as it had already taken his first wife and son, and he never once let his own fear of losing me again stop him from loving me completely anyway. Eli's voice had grown rough now, thick with feeling he no longer troubled to hide, and Silas, watching his son from across the table, felt his own eyes go unexpectedly wet. He doesn't say much, my pa, Eli continued. Never has. But I've come to understand, these 15 years, that some men say I love you with their words, and some men say it with everything else instead, with firewood stacked against a cold night, with a steady hand teaching a frightened boy to trust again, with staying, over and over, when every easier choice would have been leaving. My pa spent 15 years saying I love you in about 1,000 different ways that never once needed the actual words to make their meaning plain. He turned now, looking directly at Silas, the whole gathered town watching, tears openly running down more than one weathered face among the crowd. So I wanted to say it plain, for once, in front of everybody who watched this family get built. Eli said, his own voice breaking now. Thank you, Pa, for choosing me, when you'd already lost enough to have every right to protect yourself from risking it again. For never once making me feel like I was anything less than exactly wanted. I love you. I don't say it near often enough, on account of learning my quiet from you, I suppose. But I mean it more than I know how to properly say, and I wanted the whole town to hear it plain, same as they once heard whatever old doubts they used to carry about whether a silent man could properly raise a child nobody else wanted. Silas rose from his seat, weathered face wet with tears he made no effort to hide, and crossed the small distance to his son, and the embrace that followed, fierce and unguarded, drew the whole gathered town to its feet in an ovation that carried, everyone present understood, considerably more meaning than simple applause for a finished barn. 15 years, Silas managed finally, holding his son at arm's length to look at him properly, voice thick with feeling he'd spent a lifetime learning to express through action rather than words. Best 15 years I could have ever asked for, Eli. I love you too, son. Always have, since that very first frightened night on my porch. Just took me considerably longer than you managed today to finally say it plain. The whole of Miller's Bend wept openly that evening, watching a 15-year story of quiet, patient love find, at last, its full and proper voice. And even Beulah Sharp, who'd once declared a silent man unfit for raising a difficult child, found herself dabbing at her own unexpected tears, understanding, fully and completely, exactly how wrong her old careless judgment had proven to be. The barn raising's emotional evening passed into Miller's Bend legend within the week, told and retold at church and at the general store with the particular reverence small towns reserve for their finest shared memories. And Silas Cole, once known chiefly for his careful silence, found himself, in the months that followed, greeted everywhere with a warmth that would have seemed impossible to imagine 15 years before. Eli continued his foreman work at the Hutchins spread, though he visited home regularly enough that Hannah rarely went more than a week without his company at her table, and it was during one such ordinary Sunday visit, some months after the barn raising, that he brought news that would mark one more milestone in the family's long, patient story. I've been courting someone, he admitted over supper, with the particular careful casualness of a young man testing how a significant announcement might land. Sarah Hutchins, the rancher's daughter, been walking out with her some months now. though I wanted to be certain of my own feelings before I said anything plain about it. Hannah's face lit with immediate delight, and Silas, watching his son's careful, hopeful expression, felt an echo of his own long-ago courtship with Hannah, patient and careful and ultimately deeply worth its waiting. "She a good woman?" he asked, direct as always. "Best I know," Eli said, simple and certain, and Silas recognized in the plain sincerity of the answer an unmistakable inheritance of his own particular way of loving. Not effusive, not given to easy declaration, but steady and certain in the way that mattered most. "I expect I'll ask her to marry me. Come spring," Eli continued. "Wanted you both to know first, before I made anything official." "We're glad of it," Hannah said warmly, and Silas, though saying less, conveyed his own approval clearly enough in the steady warmth of his weathered face. Eli did marry Sarah Hutchins the following spring, in the same small Miller's Bend church that had witnessed his own christening as an unnamed infant found on its very steps 20 years before, and the wedding, like the barn raising before it, drew the whole town together in celebration of a family story that had, against every early expectation, become one of Miller's Bend's finest examples of what patient love could accomplish. Silas stood as Eli's own witness at the wedding, and found himself, watching his son exchange vows with the same steady certainty Eli brought to everything important in his life. Thinking back over the full arc of the 20 years since that first cold night on the church steps, the frightened infant left with no name, no note, no family to claim him. The careful, watchful 4-year-old who'd learned too young not to expect much from grown-ups. The boy who'd slowly, cautiously learned to trust. A silent man's steady kindness. The young man who'd finally, publicly, given voice to 15 years of largely unspoken love. Reverend Pruitt, now genuinely elderly, spoke briefly before the vows, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who'd witnessed the whole of this family's story from its very first uncertain beginning. "I have served this town nearly 30 years now," he said, "and I have watched a great many families formed through the ordinary blessing of blood, and rather fewer formed through the harder, more deliberate blessing of choice. What I witnessed on Silas Cole's porch 20 years ago was choice in its purest form. A man who had every reason to protect himself from further loss, choosing instead to risk his whole remaining capacity for love on a frightened boy nobody else could keep. That choice built, over 20 years, exactly the kind of family we celebrate today, not despite its unlikely beginning, but because of the particular grace with which that beginning was met." Silas, standing beside his son at the altar, found his own eyes wet with tears he no longer troubled to hide. 20 years of careful, patient love finding, in this moment, its fullest and most complete expression yet. After the ceremony, as the whole town gathered on the church lawn for the celebration that followed, Eli found a quiet moment to stand beside his father, watching the warm chaos of the gathering with the particular contentment of a man whose whole life had, at last, come fully into its proper shape. "Never thought a scared 4-year-old on your porch would end up here," he said quietly, watching Sarah laugh with Hannah a short distance off. "Neither did I," Silas admitted. "Best surprise of my whole life, though. Every single day of it." Eli reached out and rested his hand on his father's shoulder, an echo of the same gesture Silas had offered him countless times across 20 years of steady, patient love. "Thank you, Pa," he said simply. "For everything. For all of it." Silas covered his son's hand with his own, weathered and steady, and found, standing together on the church lawn as the whole of Miller's Bend celebrated around them, that he needed no further words to answer. 20 years of quiet, faithful action having already said, more completely than any speech ever could, exactly what needed saying between a silent man and the son he'd chosen, against every careful instinct toward self-protection, to love completely and without reservation for the whole remainder of both their lives. If stories of quiet love, second chances, and families built through choice rather than blood speak to your heart, we would be honored to have you join us for the next journey. Thank you for walking this road with Silas and Eli, and with the town of Miller's Bend. We will see you next time.